Hello and welcome to another video aiming to get you grades 7, 8 and 9. Again looking at 5 key quotations to help you analyse the poems and to easily compare them using the Mr. Salles method, the Foss way. Now unusually a full analysis of this poem Poppies by Jane Weir is actually available on YouTube, with Jane Weir in the whole video explaining it. It's had nearly 42,000 views and look, 102 likes and 51 dislikes, which is a terrible proportion and suggests that people who watch the video don't really like Jane Weir. So having warned you of that, I will put a link up here somewhere in the video with the little eye, a card linking to that video. It's well worth a watch. And one of the central questions that we're going to ask about this poem is it actually a war poem? Is the son in this actually going off to war? Now, what's useful about that question is that it gives you more than one interpretation, which is the easy way to get into grades 7 and above. Okay, let's get into that first quotation. She's imagining pinning a poppy, or remembering pinning a poppy, to the lapel of his blazer. Spasms of red disrupting a blockade of yellow bias binding around your blazer. Now there's lots to unpack in the symbolism here. So the red paper obviously is the poppy, but the arrangement of the paper is in spasms. Now this obviously is in the semantic field of pain, and it conveys her physical pain at saying goodbye to her son, but it also hints at the possibility of his pain in death. The red is obviously symbolic of blood. So at the moment of pinning the poppy to his blazer, she is imagining his eventual death. If it's a war poem, or the spasms indicate her own emotions at saying goodbye to a son who is leaving home. Similarly, we've got this word here, a blockade. Now what we need to know is that Jane Weir is a clothes maker. She's using the vocabulary here of stitching, of embroidery, of making patterns on clothes. But a blockade is also a maneuver in war where you block supplies coming to the enemy. So again, her language is suggestive of war. Then we see where that embroidery is. It's the binding around your blazer. So you can imagine that trim on the lapel. The word blazer is not a soldier's uniform. This is a school uniform. Or it is the kind of formal blazer you wear in a formal kind of dress, perhaps suggesting that her son is now going to school or to university. And because Weir has not had a son going off to war, she's imagining that experience, she's also basing this on real experiences that she's had with her own son, and she wants us to imagine both possibilities at the same time. So one version of the poem is going to be the mother's grief at the loss of her son in war, and the other version is going to be the mother's grief at losing her son from her home as he goes off to live life independently. Now we're going to explore a lot of imagery which shows the son's relationship with his mother and her realization that actually he's desperate to get away, and there's a possible realization that her approach to him is actually part of the reason he wants to go. So first let's look at the metaphor describing his gelled hair. She describes them as blackthorns of your hair. Now partly that's an image of nature, suggesting his purity if you like, but it's also really thorny, and he seems as though he's deliberately picked a hairstyle which will discourage her from touching it, and this obviously is metaphorical. It also suggests it's a way that he is prickly towards her. He wants to break away from the bonds of motherhood. Perhaps he feels that she is an oppressive mother. Well, then we look at how she reacts. So instead of reacting with emotion, All her words are flattened, rolled, turned into felt. So here again we've got the imagery of clothing, of material, and she describes felt in her video as being made of different layers. And so she's imagining her language here being rolled out and layered and flattened. The word felt obviously reminds us of feelings as well. And so her words are conveying how she feels, but she's not actually coming out and telling her son how she really feels, because felt is soft. Her words have flattened, they are not sharp. She's not revealing her true emotions. Now this, of course, can be hugely irritating to her son, who is her opposite. So the metaphor of the black thorns of his hair show that he does express his emotions exactly as they are. He doesn't try to repress them. But his mother does repress her emotions, which is an irritating feature, because it means you have to pay real attention to her words to understand what they mean. Now, if you're a male, you're probably very used to this division between male and female forms of communicating. A male is much more likely to express what they mean and understand it, whereas a female is much more likely to have all this nuance in what they're saying, and the male just can't be bothered with all that nuance. Now, she seems to understand that, because instead of building something solid with her words that her son can understand, instead the felt is slowly melting. Now, obviously, that reflects how her feelings are slowly melting, perhaps suggesting her tears, but it also means her words don't have proper meaning. They don't have a real shape and substance. They are, in fact, just melting into meaninglessness. This bizarre metaphor could also signify how the son simply doesn't understand her. Next, she gives us a delightful simile which shows how she decides to protect her son from her own emotions. So she throws open the front door, the world overflowing like a treasure chest. So she realizes that letting him go is offering him a great treasure of the life outside. Now, for me, this simile breaks with the idea of this being a war poem. It doesn't make sense in terms of a son going off to war. Even a son who's excited about joining up with the army isn't excited about the world being a treasure chest. It's contained. It's something that you go out and collect. It just doesn't make sense to me as a description of someone going off to war. It makes sense as someone going off to find opportunities and experiences. And because this is the mother's description, it also suggests that she realizes she's letting her son free in order to have greater experiences of life, even though his parting causes her to melt, causes her pain. So for me, in the middle of the poem, it ceases to be a poem about war. And that continues with this other delightful metaphor here. After you'd gone, I went into your bedroom, released a songbird from its cage. So, in one sense, he is the songbird who has been trapped in the cage of the family home, or trapped by this protective love from his mother, but now he is gone and he's going to be able to find his own song. And there's something really generous here in the fact that he's gone. But this is also a poem. And I like this image because it suggests once the son has left home, it has given the poet a new identity. She is now the songbird, able to live freely and write her own bird song, if you like, in the form of the poem. We could even say she's grateful for this experience because the heightened emotion that it's given her has given her the subject and the tone of her bird song. Now would be a good time as well to focus on the direct address. She's writing this directly to her son. Now that could imply that she's getting him to look back on her emotions and his emotions on the day that he left. It's an expression of her love. you don't need this then to be a letter, if you like, written to him after he's dead. The poem ends with a lot of symbolism for us to unpick again. So now that she's gone through the graveyard and she's leaning against the war memorial, she sees a dove in the sky. Now a dove, of course, is a symbol of peace. If it's a war poem, we can choose to see the dove as symbolic of her son's soul now being free. But the dove also reminds us of the songbird, which was the sun or the poet finding her voice. So in that sense, the image is very positive. They are both free. She's free to write her poetry and he's free, enjoying the treasure chest of opportunities that life has offered. And that's implied by the freedom of the sky. She also imagines the dove as like a needle pulling a thread, because it's creating the ornamental stitch. And this stitch, if you like, is what links her son to herself, the poem. The ornament is the poem itself, and the dove is the son who, if you like, whose freedom has now created this poem. So she stands here listening, hoping to hear your playground voice catching on the wind. Now for me, this choice of the playground voice suggests the young child that she wants to return. This doesn't work so well as a war poem. If it had been a war poem, it's the young adult that she'd like returned. But if it's just about a son leaving home, then it's the memories of what that son was like when he was young that she's trying to recapture. Now if you watch her video, she's in all of it. It shows us the graveyard that she's talking about, the war memorial that she's talking about. These are all real, but her dead son is not real. This is an imagined dead son. Instead, she talks about taking her youngest son up the hill, beyond, through the graveyard that isn't a negative place. It's not symbolic of death. It's somewhere that they would play. And then further up the hill to the war memorial, where she actually stands and says, look, you can hear the voices coming up from the school playground below the hill. So ultimately for me, I find this more satisfying as a song about motherhood and the poet discovering her own voice when she's finally able to set her son on the path to adulthood. However, it is deliberately written to also be read as a war poem if you choose, and hence the idea of the poppies and the Armistice Sunday, and in particular the choice of title. I do find the title a bit contrived. It doesn't quite fit the poem. For a start, it's plural, where there's only one poppy that's placed on the boy's lapel. And secondly, the poppies begin at the beginning of this poem as though she starts it trying to write a war poem. In fact, she was asked to write a war poem by Carol Ann Duffy. But as you can see in the quotations I've highlighted, the poppies soon disappear, and so does the real theme of warfare. It's there under the surface if you want to interpret the poem that way, but you don't have to. And I particularly like the recurrent bird imagery to suggest the freedom of the poet finding her own voice at the same time as she allows her son to find his own voice and his own freedom. So we've talked about the opening, we've obviously talked about the ending, we've analysed quite a lot of language features, the metaphors and the similes. We've looked at the semantic field of embroidery and stitching, and also linked that to the semantic field of war. Now, as you know, you have to write about the form in order to get the top grades. And this is a poem that deliberately doesn't have form. So there aren't a set number of syllables per line. It's not rhyming. We've got 3 stanzas of 8, 7 and 8. So there isn't really a form going on at all. And I'd say the reason for that is this is a poet, a mother, exploring her own feelings. It feels therefore like a monologue, which is a natural half of a conversation to her son. And this brings us to the structure, which I think is a form of discovery. So she begins with the interior life where she's dealing with his clothes. He's not there. The reason we know he's not there is she's now telling him what she's done to his clothes. She wouldn't be able to tell him that if he was there at the time. It would sound stupid. Then she moves from her actions to trying to explain her feelings to him, and the conflicting feelings of really missing him because he's going, but being excited for him because of the opportunities ahead of him once he leaves. And then we've got this interesting dual way of looking at his going, where the songbird represents his freedom, but it also represents her finding her own voice and her freedom. So in this image, son and mother share the same experience of freedom. And then finally, I think in the structure, we're going to comment on the way she also ends with this image of the bird. Now, the dove I didn't mention is also a Christian allusion here. So when Noah took all the animals on the ark and it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, the dove was used every day. Noah released the dove, and if it didn't come back, that gave him hope that there would be land. If there were no land, then the dove would have to return. And what actually happens is the dove does return with a bit of an olive branch in its beak, which indicates that the tragedy of the flood is over. And for me, I like that. It suggests here, symbolically, that the dove is suggesting that there isn't a tragedy in this poem. It does end happily. But of course, the structure could also be used ironically there. She wants it to end happily. She's desperately hoping to hear the playground voice, but it never comes. Not because the son has grown up, but because he's dead. He's been killed in war. So you make your choice. I hope you found this video really beneficial, and you're now ready to get the top grades using the Foss way to compare to your other poems. As usual, give me your comments if you like this kind of video. Don't forget to subscribe if you'd like more. See you soon on my channel.